Hello, and welcome to episode 12 of Root Causes, a Not My Generation podcast.
Podcast that hopes to bring a national discussion on the differing intersections of the fight to end gun violence. This is your host,
Elijah Nichols,
and Addison Moore from DC.
Welcome to Root Causes.
Today, we'll be discussing gun violence in the Latinx community with two amazing guests, Ana Lemus Pais and Andrea Gonalez.
Welcome, y'all. How are y'all doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. It was a long day, but I'm so excited to be here with y'all. I haven't seen you guys in forever, and seeing your faces are such a good thing to see. But yeah, I'm doing good.
This was like my first day off in a while, so I'm really enjoying it, and this is just making it all the much better.
Oh, well, that makes me happy to hear. What have y'all been up to recently?
So I'm based in Lenape Land, which is also known as New York City. I've been basically on the ground a lot of the time. I'm working a part-time job. I'm trying to figure out schooling, and I'm also in a lot of marches and protests and making sure I'm there for my community. It's really tiring on the soul, but I'm happy that I'm doing it.
I am pretty much in the same boat. I'm working two part-time jobs, and when I'm not doing that, I've just been in the protests, fighting. I've spent a lot of time down in Aurora for all of the Elijah Nichols things, so that's pretty much it, yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much for the work that y'all do. Every time I see y'all posting something, I'm like, let me reshare it because two most amazing organizers. So thank you for being on the show with us. So basically, to get going into this conversation, I guess, we wanted to hear from you about how both of you got involved in the fight to end gun violence.
Yeah, I could go first, unless Ana, do you want to go?
No, go for it.
Okay. Also, I didn't even introduce myself. So, hi, folks. My name is Andrea Alejandra Gonzalez. I'm based again in New York City. I started my work with gun violence when I was about 15 years old, but I've been doing social justice work around the intersection of race and gender since I was way younger. But I started doing this work because a couple of weeks after Parkland, my school got like a copycat situation, and we were in lockdown for a couple of hours. And I was always really hyper aware of the obsession America has with guns and this like violence that's plaguing our schools and our communities. But I really felt that it was important for me to join an organization following that, because I didn't want my work to be only concentrated within my group of peers and my family. I wanted to go outside of that and go into my community and really talk about violence and how to stop that.
My name is Ana Paulina Lemus Pais. I am based in Denver, Colorado for right now. I became involved specifically in gun violence prevention after Parkland. I grew up in the Columbine community. I graduated from Columbine High School. But after Parkland, that was just very close to when my family and I got our citizenship, and I felt safe to really go out and make my voice heard and be given a voice in my community. Besides that, my entire family and I are very deeply rooted in immigration rights, all of those kinds of things. We work a lot with refugees. I try to do a lot of stuff with gender work and things like that.
Awesome. Thank y'all for talking about the ways that y'all have gotten involved with the work to end gun violence. So I know from my perspective as a queer and trans Black person, ooh, got a lot of layers there, that the way that I like my identity in a lot of ways informed the direction I took my work in. And so I'm curious is how does your identity as Latinx people impact your work in the gun violence prevention movement?
Personally, just like, again, where I am, the Columbine area, it's just always kind of been on our minds no matter what happens. And last year on the 20th anniversary, we did have a copycat of the original Columbine shooting. So it's just something that is always prevalent in this area. Personally, my own story, my parents and I immigrated from Guatemala, which is in Central America, right underneath Mexico. And they grew up during a civil war. So they are extremely hyper aware of guns and just how it affects all of the different communities that we've been a part of. And especially living in Colorado, there are a lot of areas here that are extremely anti-immigrant and pro-gun. So it's just always something you kind of have to be worried about. But I feel blessed to say that I've been able to find a safe space and a safe community in this fight against gun violence here in Colorado.
My experience with my identity also aligns a lot with Anna's point, I grew up a lot of my life with my parents being undocumented, and the work that I do now, it makes me really consider about just all these different intersections that we live at and the privileges that we hold. And so even though my parents are undocumented, we were able to make it in New York City. And I'm really grateful for that. But, also understanding that folks that look like me, folks that live in the same city are being gunned down, folks in the same city are dying in their communities. I think I take my Latinx identity and I recognize that as a privilege. As a non-Black Latinx person, I need to make sure that I am dismantling and disrupting anti-Blackness in the Latinx community. And that's what I do with my gun violence prevention work. I really want to make sure that with everything that I do, I am doing it for the larger community and not just me, not just Peruvian immigrants, not just immigrants that's made it. I want to be fighting for the ones that are at the intersection, at the most vulnerable places in this country. So that's how I use my Latinx identity to influence the work that I do.
Thank you for sharing the important perspective that a Latinx person, that many Latinx individuals, that they give, So thank you so much for sharing your perspective on the world and your perspective on the gun violence prevention movement and the way you navigate spaces. Sort of going off of that, this question, when Addison and I were sort of thinking about what should we talk about specifically in this episode, because it's a much needed episode. Like you touched on, both of you, the idea of intersectionality, but not only intersectionality in practice, but really an identity as well. Here at Not My Generation, we understand that Latinx doesn't just look one way, because it's such a multifaceted identity group or identity in general. There's Black Latinx individuals, there's Indigenous Latinx individuals, and so many other multifaceted identities within the at-large Latinx community. And so we were kind of wondering, how does this reality impact the way that you do work as a Latinx person?
I think it's really unique, like the experience of being Latinx and also working within the Latinx community. Like I've experienced racism within my own community, and it gets really hard sometimes because, I'm fighting for them and it doesn't feel like they love me back, even though I'm loving them with my whole heart. And so I think it just like goes back to what I was saying before as well, just thinking about how we're doing this for the larger community. And there's so many other things we need to consider. In Peru and in all Latinx communities, there's so much like anti-indigeneity, so much anti-Blackness. And it's hurtful to see the way that, we talk about the Latinx community being so united and having like as it a singular race, but that's not what it is at all. Latinidad is not a race. It's a culture, and it's a beautiful one. It extends across countries, across borders. It has a language, it has music. It's beautiful, but it's really important to understand that Latinidad expresses itself in so many different ways, and Latinidad is also very hateful and hurtful a lot of the times. Queer Latinx folks are excluded because they're not Latino enough, in the same way that hurts Indigenous Latinx people and Black Latinx people. So it's really important when we're talking about Latinidad, we're talking about how complex this culture is, and how we need to also discuss ethnicity and nationality and race, and not be conflating any of those vocabulary words, because they're all necessary in the conversation.
Kind of to go off of that, really leaning into the different crossroads, it's so strange that the whole Latinx community kind of gets put under a certain kind of person. Like everyone kind of thinks we should look like Jennifer Lopez or Cristiano Ronaldo, when that's like completely opposite from the fact. I have cousins who have like naturally blonde hair and blue eyes, and then I also have family members that are Afro-Latino. And then our countries are filled with Indigenous people who have genuinely had to fight wars over their land and over the right to just exist. And at the same time, it's a very different conversation in the States, where there are a lot of Latinx identifying people that are extremely anti-legal immigrants, will look down on others for just trying to get into this country the only ways they know how. So it's very harmful to put us all under one umbrella term. But at the same time, it is kind of the one thing that unites us. There is definitely a large part about being in any community and speaking for Latinx people is just the knowledge that some immigrants don't feel safe speaking for themselves. Personally, I know some people that have chosen kind of to step away and still be in the movement, but not necessarily make their voices heard, just because they are incredibly afraid of ICE and deportation and the entire immigration system that just continuously gets broken down every single day. So a lot of being in any movement as a Latinx person is standing up for your values and having to stand up for others as well.
Y'all said that so beautifully. Like, how can I even, But thank you all for sharing as well. Like, just being very frank about the different ways that Latinx people exist. Because I think that there is this misconception that there is this one way that Latinx people exist. And like, personally, from experience in school, I'm very lucky that I went to a school that praised global citizenship. And a lot of what we learned and had to do was talk to other identities. And I had a chance to understand that, like, there's an image that is seen and shown, and I think breaking that down and understanding that, just like with any identity, there's no one way that Latinx folks can exist, and there's not one way that they look or act or think or anything like that. So thank you all for sharing that. It's really important. And just thinking about the Latinx community and talking about the ways that y'all navigate gun violence prevention work, where and how do you see gun violence show up within the Latinx community itself?
Just in the way that gun violence really gets reported, you don't hear a lot about Latinx people because genuinely, mostly in news cycles, they just want to report about like the big mass shootings. And we have had some of those. Like if you look at El Paso, that was incredibly directed towards a Latinx community. And the shooter's point was to attack the Latinx community. But at the same time, a lot of rampant gun violence shows up in police brutality and gang violence. That's the kind of stuff that doesn't always make like major headlines and that people don't really want to pay attention to.
Yeah, just a second on this point. I think the way that the Latinx community experiences gun violence is largely, I think, through state violence. I've seen so many times where just like ICE or police or just the state in general have like put guns to the heads of Latinx young people, of Latinx elders, just our community members. Recently, 3 young people in California were killed. 3 Latinx young people were killed in California. And also, we can't forget the case of Gonzalez. She was killed by ICE. And so there's so many circumstances that are just not covered for a multitude of reasons, mostly because I think that these Latinx folks, their proximity to whiteness wasn't enough to matter. And so these young people were just ignored. They were covered up and they just didn't matter because they were visibly people of color. And that's another thing to recognize, that like, because Latinidad is so, it's so diverse and so large, like, there's white Latinos too. And so white Latinos, they have a specific privilege, like, not always white Latinos are going to experience that kind of violent racism because they can pass as white. They are white in this country, and that's just the frankness of it. And so like Latinos that don't have that privilege are often at the other side of that violence. And it's just really important to recognize that and how it's covered up, because they just don't want to talk about it. Undocumented Latinos and low-income Latinos are just not part of this conversation, and they don't want to be discussed, and solutions aren't necessarily centered around them.
To add one thing really quick to that, there's been like a really good example recently of like something that was definitely thrown under wraps that got brought up just because of so many people our age just like consistently bringing it up and asking for accountability. Vanessa Guillen, she was on an army base, which seems like a very safe place to be, but like even then, like here was a Latinx person who was killed and murdered and raped and all other sorts of horrible things. And it was definitely buried under wraps and no one really talked about it until there was a huge movement on social media, because like people don't really like seeing these institutions that you think should be trustworthy do something so horrific to a person.
I realize how far into this conversation that we've gotten, and there's something that I think would be helpful for our audience is explaining what Latinx means and what it encompasses. Because I think in us talking about that, there's one image that people have. Because I realized when you were speaking, Andrea and Anna, that, we are talking about there are Black Latinx folks, there are white Latinx folks, there are Indigenous Latinx folks, there are queer Latinx folks. So what does it mean to be Latinx? Because I think that would be something really important to talk about.
Yeah, I think the textbook definition is, well, there's 2 that's often like switched out. So being Hispanic is knowing the Spanish language. That includes Spain, that includes Colombia, that includes Bolivia, but that does not include Brazil because they speak Portuguese. But actually Brazil is part of the Latinx identity because it's in Latin America. So Latinx kind of defines like geography kind of, and being Hispanic defines kind of a lingual unification across across oceans. And so it's a little complicated, and we should not switch them out because they mean very specific things.
And then as for the like Latinx, a couple of years ago, it was more in terms of like, oh, they're Latinos or Latinas. But more recently, with the huge emergence of the LGBTQ community, and out of respect for them, we switched to Latinx just because the entire Spanish language is either masculine or feminine. Like every single thing has a gender, a pear, a tree, everything has that. Yeah, it's a little ridiculous, but that's just kind of how our language is built. So we created kind of a neutral third-party term to reference to all of us to make sure that no members are excluded based on their gender identity.
Oh, also, instead of Latinx, you can also use Latines. So it's like whatever flows off the tongue more. Both of them just like is a gender neutral way of referring to the community. And, the X also gets introduced into actual vocabulary. So you can actually like replace it for the A's and the O's.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, I should because I was trying to learn Spanish again, and I was like, oh, how am I going to tell people pronouns? So now I know. Now I know.
Use those pronouns.
So thank y'all for explaining that. I know that because sometimes we know what words mean and we understand those things, but I think it's really important to name it and talk about it. So I really do appreciate y'all talking about that and thinking of Spanish and me. So I remember when I was younger and in Spanish class, I was thankful enough that they taught us about machismo, right? And in America, I understand toxic masculinity and how that shows up and what that looks like. But there's a specific term and it's machismo for the Latinx community. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit more and pick your brains a bit about, how could you explain how toxic masculinity or machismo to listeners, especially, how it may perpetuate violence within the Latinx community?
Yeah, I think, machismo just basically translates to like male chauvinism, but that's like just in Spanish. And I think toxic masculinity and machismo just like kind of appears itself in like basically any culture. But like, I think like this kind of expectation of young men having to be this type of person and push back their emotions and present in a certain way and express themselves in a certain way that takes power away from them. And that's the way that I often refer to like gun violence working. It's when people feel powerless. They don't have enough power. And so they look to a firearm to take that power back. And that often results in extreme harm that cannot be repaired. And so I feel like the way that this impacts the Latinx community, it's just we are forcing these young Latino boys into this like image, and they're forced to conform themselves, and that often gets them into these situations where they just hurt themselves or hurt others. And that's also a form of gun violence, and that can also connect to the prison industrial complex and policing as well. We're hurting our community with machismo, and I think it's part of addressing gun violence is also addressing this kind of internal hatred that we have, and this toxic masculinity that we all have, not just men, but also women, and just unpacking that and seeing what that means, and kind of being like, just coming to terms with both sides of our nature and just making sure that we're healed internally so that we can heal our community externally.
Machismo in a lot of ways is very connected with very religious aspects of Latin America. When we were colonized, it was very much under the Catholic Church, and that's still a very prevalent institution in Latin America. It's continuously one of the biggest institutions. Most of the population identifies as Catholic, and a lot of that goes hand in hand with just like how men are supposed to act, how they're supposed to feel, how they're supposed to treat women, especially because a lot of times Latinx women are abused a lot, and they're taken advantage of in all areas, especially in indigenous areas, which is heartbreaking. But those numbers are like sky high. There's so much abuse towards women. And especially with the destabilization of Latin America, a lot of the machismo kind of turned into gang violence and working in drug rings and things like that are still incredibly prevalent throughout the region and still affect pretty much all Latinos to this day.
Yeah, and to add actually to what Ana said, I like talking about like, gender roles in Latino America. Um, this machismo also impacts the way that, these men that are impacted by toxic masculinity interact with queer community members. And so that also connects to like, the murder of trans folks in our community, that connects to the harming of trans folks in our community. And so it's really important to see the way that toxic masculinity harms everybody in some kind of way, not just folks that conform to a binary, but also people that are outside of that binary. And it's just really violent. And growing up within that culture is just, it's very hard as a young woman, just to like experience that kind of violence from the men in the community. But I like I said before, I think that's something that's community work. I think that's like, that's where activism really has to show up, love for your community and love for the people, even the ones who have so much to learn. And I think our young men definitely need a lot of love to unpack all of that pain that they have in them.
Yeah, I just want to thank you, both of you, for highlighting like the LGBTQ plus community, and highlighting the role that gender really plays in this, and the communal sort of like recreation of hierarchies, whether it be racial hierarchies that the white man has created, or whether it be the gendered hierarchies, which is so complex. It could be like people spend their whole entire lives talking about these things, or like proximity to capital, and this is it's just I'm learning so much. So thank you. And I hope that the listeners are learning so much and really digging deep into their brains and understanding how like to really help one another, we have to drive community solutions. And that starts at breaking down the hierarchies within our own communities. And it's a constant struggle because everywhere that we look at, there's a hierarchy of some sort.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that sort of like that idea, like the idea of hierarchy and the idea of systems and structures and the way that it forces individuals to turn to gun violence, it sort of brings it into this next question. So like when we're thinking of gun violence prevention work, a lot of people think of policy and they think of voting, but both of you in different ways have touched on the importance of community in the reality of ending gun violence. How do you believe that this emphasis on voting impacts the way that Latinx people, or yourselves even, engage in the gun violence prevention movement?
Well, oof, okay. I know personally, I only gained citizenship 3 years ago. And I know personally, I was not willing to really get involved with any sort of political work because the issue of voting was always pushed forward. And just because of like the country that I was born in, I didn't see that I could participate in these kinds of practices. And then genuinely, once I became a citizen, I became so much more involved in any sort of political social justice work. And I'm very blessed that both my parents have dedicated their lives to immigration. My mother works as an immigration lawyer, and my dad chooses to work with day workers. And especially just having them in the house and working with them, it's really shown me that community really is the most important thing. And it's really not something that is pushed a lot, which is really sad to me. I feel like people just think like, well, if I vote, that's it. But voting should be the bare minimum. You should be willing to go out into these communities and help with people and hire them for jobs. If there are day worker centers anywhere in your area, you totally should. They're very dependable workers. And there just needs to be a stronger emphasis on community. And if you are someone who doesn't really know how to go about that, it can be just as simple as like speaking out about what ICE is doing and how they're policing us and what they're doing in their camps and what Trump is doing to immigration law. Like I know recently, just 2 days ago, their whole thing that they were pushing about having all of these international students get deported, it just got rolled back. But in that like week, that was the strongest support I've seen for the Latinx community in quite a while. And I think that should be the momentum that just keeps rolling because there are people that are suffering because of ICE, but it's not making headlines every day. That doesn't mean it doesn't matter.
Yeah, like absolutely. Like I just want to second everything that Anna said. I think that we really need to focus on community above everything else that we do, because, we can put every single law about gun violence prevention, we can put in background checks, we can put in, close up all these loopholes, but at the end of the day, ICE can still kill us, because that's not a gun violence prevention conversation. It should be, but it's currently not. And so I think, that goes back to like every single like social justice issue that we're talking about. Strong communities make all of these systems of oppression obsolete. They don't work anymore when communities are there. And so when we make sure that undocumented folks have jobs, have food on their table, have opportunities, have education, they won't need to resort to violence or illegal air quotes to get by, right? They will have the resources there to thrive and survive and take care of their communities and take care of their families. We need to think about, these acts of violence that are committed, the gun violence. These aren't actions because our communities don't want to hurt each other. It's about powerlessness. It's about pain. It's about this unpacked problems that we're facing. And so when we really sit down as a community and figure out, like, why are we experiencing this violence? Why is the perpetrator hurting people? What are the internal things that are at work right now that are hurting people? And why are we continuing to let that happen? Like, why are we just sitting down and like putting folks in jail? And so, when we think about what do we do next, like next steps, we cannot only focus on voting. Folks can't vote, and a lot of times, like the Latinx community, we are also incarcerated at a really high rate. Incarcerated folks cannot vote. And so when we think about, voting, that excludes so many people. And then also protesting, protesting is an amazing way of getting out into the street. And it's important to do that. And everyone who's able should definitely do that. But the thing is, when you're undocumented, you face the risk of getting arrested, and then you face deportation. And so it's like, not everyone can join the protest either. And so it's just really important to make sure that we are offering different ways into this space, into these activist spaces, so that anyone can get involved. We need to make sure that we're making this work accessible and that anyone can access this at any given time, and make sure that we're coming to them rather than them coming to us.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for saying how it needs to be said. I think every single person in the gun violence prevention movement, if you're a listener, if you're not engaged, understand that the gun violence prevention movement is a space that is about combating, dismantling every system of oppression. It's not just about ensuring that we don't have guns in certain communities, because that is a portion of it, but it's about abolishing the prison industrial complex. It's about abolishing ICE. That is gun violence prevention work. And if you're leaving that outside of it, then you're not doing gun violence prevention work. You're doing gun control work, which is not going to save communities at the end of the day.
I will echo what Elijah said. Thank you all for sharing like a lot of what you have so far. Just beautiful, beautiful things that you all are always saying, and I love it. So thank you again. So from you all's experience and perspective, what are some ways that folks can better support the Latinx community, both in relations to gun violence and just tearing down the systems of oppression that we've been talking about?
I think there's like a large part of it. This really goes for any kind of viewpoint, but don't become a single issue voter. Like, if you are going to put an emphasis on voting, really listen to like everything a candidate has to say, because a lot of times they really can hide a lot of really, really harmful things that would hurt immigrant communities or communities of color or Latinx communities specifically. And you don't really pay attention to it because you're so busy listening to other bigger issues that they push more towards the front, which is something a lot of politicians tend to do. Listen to the communities that are speaking, especially when they're undocumented, just because, if they're risking their lives, if they're risking their safety, if they're risking their home, to tell you something, that means it's important to them, and you should 100% be listening to what they have to say. Again, continue to call for the abolishment of ICE, because it is one of the most harmful systems, and it is throwing so many innocent people in these systems. It is ripping families apart. It is completely destroying homes that people have fought their entire lives for. And learn about our history, especially the destabilization of Latin America, what happened in the 70s, all of the civil wars that happened because of that, and the continuous violence that keeps happening, that isn't heard about in the news, because they just want you to see our communities as dangerous and drug ridden and crime ridden, which is so inaccurate.
Starting off with the last point that Anna said, I think recognizing the role that the United States has played in this crisis that we're facing, these civil wars, the violence that we experience, the violence that has pushed our people outside of their borders and into this country, and now they're being incarcerated for it, has been started mostly by the United States. And so the United States is accountable for a lot of the bad things that's happened to our people. And so I think that it's really important to know the history and the way that, white supremacy and the United States and just like the global North has imposed violence on us is really important. And then I think something else that folks can be doing is just really unpacking what Latinx means. The things that we're talking about in the beginning, Latinidad is so unique and so complex. And I think it's really just important to recognize all of the complexities of it if you want to advocate for us. And if going to advocating, you don't need to create new organizations to protect Latinx folks. There is a ton of them already in the United States. There are a ton of people advocating for us. And as a matter of fact, there is a ton of Latinx folks advocating for Latinx folks. And so if you are of privilege, or you're just not Latinx, come to our spaces. We have them. We're here with open arms. We need your support. And don't I think this is a conversation about allyship as well, about just not taking up so much space. Just sit there and listen to what we want to say, about what needs to change, about what the solutions are, because the people who are impacted by these systems know what the solutions are, because we face them every day. We know how to fix them. And so when people just sit down and listen to us, that's how things can actually change. And so people who want to uplift us and advocate for us, just make sure that you're listening and not changing up our words. If we mean undocumented, we mean undocumented, not illegal, not any of that other nonsense that people like to use. The vocabulary we use is specific and intentional. And so folks need to also be very mindful about the vocabulary that they use to uplift us. And I think it's just all goes back to being a good ally. Just know your stuff and listen and sit back and let folks tell you what to do. And I think that's just a really important thing to everything. Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's something that whether you're in the gun violence prevention space or any kind of space, reimagining is the most important thing that you need to be doing, and no matter what work you do.
Yeah, no, thank y'all for talking about that allyship piece. I think people sometimes need to be reminded that you just need to sit back and listen and let people talk and learn on your own without exhausting the community you're trying to be an ally to. I think that's really important. And just think, as we continue this conversation, thinking of allyship, and moving on from there, for you as at Latinx identifying folks, what is a piece of advice that you'd give to other Latinx identifying people who are looking to get involved in the gun violence prevention movement?
I have a couple points. You have to make sure that the space you're entering is safe to you and it listens to you and you're not being tokenized. That is something that happens so often. Make sure you're not just there as a centerpiece and you're not just there so their organization can look great for group pictures. Make sure if you're there, your voice is actually being heard and you're being respected and you're being uplifted. And don't let the issues of you or your people be drowned out just because it makes other people in your coalitions uncomfortable. I know it's done to Central America. Don't enter those spaces so desperate to change their minds that you end up hurting your own mental health. And make sure that the spaces you're entering are willing to uplift you instead of just have you there but off to the side.
Yeah, everything that Anna said. I was actually snapping behind the scenes. This is an audio, but if you could see me, I'm snapping. Yeah, just I've had personal experience in those kinds of violent spaces, those white dominated spaces, and it's really violent. And you get used to that kind of stuff. You get pushed down. You can't really talk that much. All of that is not normal, and they make you feel like it's normal, but it is 100% not normal. And a lot of I've also experienced a lot of co-opting. I will bring something up about ICE and then I won't be allowed to say it, but they will, because it looks better coming out of their mouths. So that's not normal. Don't let that happen to you. I mean, I'm a really passive person, so I was in that relationship, in that organization for a very long time, because no one was really advocating for me behind the scenes, letting me know what was wrong. But I'm here to be your friend and like push for you. You can totally DM me. I would love to like talk to you through this. But yeah, I think it's like just making sure you're protecting your own health. You know, it's hard to protect a community when you're not protecting yourself. And so you need to make sure that you're just being there for yourself and healing. But also having the identity of being Latinx comes with a lot of baggage as well. So unpack that like on your own. It's a lot. And, you know, just recognizing your position within the Latinx community. Like Anna was saying before, like there's privilege within the community itself. You know, some people aren't undocumented, some folks aren't Black, some folks aren't Indigenous, some folks aren't queer. There's privileges within the community, and recognizing your identity in relation to Latinidad is so important to every space that you enter, if it, not only the gun violence prevention space, but also just being a good community member to other Latinx people. So it's just really important, just checking in with yourself and knowing where you're at and how your identity is reflected in spaces and what kind of privilege you have, so that, you know, we can all be happier and safer together.
Yeah, thank you both for the time to speak with us about these important topics, about the intersections of gun violence, about the Latinx community, and about so much more. We hope to possibly have you back soon. And I'm happy to be in conversation with you.
Thank you for listening to episode 12 of Root Causes, a Not My Generation podcast, where we discussed gun violence in the Latinx community with Ana Lemus and Andrea Gonzalez. Please join us next Tuesday for an episode on youth power.
In solidarity, Elijah Nichols,
Addison Moore,
Ana Lemus
and Andrea Alejandra Gonzalez.